So we begin. Welcome, Venerable, all my friends, and Hannah Hall, and the friends in the Zoom. Welcome to this lecture. My name is Chu Jian Kuo. I'm the writer for the Institute for the Humanity Studying Community Buddhism, IHB, and also is a system professor in religious studies. And it's nice to have this occasion to have this action. So I make some open remarks to begin this lecture. Ritual is a way of a bodily practice. When people attend a ritualized event, ritual embodies the dynamic of their inner mind, their belief, and their faith. For this function, every religious tradition in the world always includes a ritual component to gather its power and civilize them into the model of ideal beverages. In addition, when individuals attend a ritual event in front of the public eyes, he or she claims his or her religious identity through immersing himself or herself in the aura of the sacredness intentionally crafted by the producer of a ritual assembly. A profane individual is reformed to a religious life. As other types of spiritual practice, like a meditation, ritual always involve a focus. Such focus assists participants to escape their worldly concerns, at least temporarily during the ritualized moment, and to concentrate their mind and their body behavior on what instruction and the message revealed from the ritual they are participating within. Chanting is one of the ritualized focus for this spiritual purpose. Chanting involves in a ritual activity like today's Dr. Bloom topics the Waterland Dharma Assembly, developed in Chinese Buddhist tradition, not only produce an aura of the sacredness for this ritualized assembly, together with other ritual objects, but also facilitates the participant having a focus to envision what Buddhist instruction and the message they are going to immerse in. Today, we are lucky to have Dr. Phillip Bloom give us an opportunity to learn Waterland Dharma Assembly through its chanting component. Dr. Bloom, currently June and Simon K.C. Lee curator of the Chinese Garden and the director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies in the Huntington Library, our museum. He is a specialist in the history of the art and the gardens of China's Song Dynasty. He received his PhD in Chinese art history from Harvard University in 2013, writing his dissertation on the visual culture of the Waterland retreat. Today, his work focuses on shaping the intellectual and cultural life of the Huntington's Chinese Garden by developing exhibition, hobby programs, and the artist residence. Prior to join the Huntington in 2017, he served as an assistant professor of East Asian art history at Indiana University, Bloomington, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Tokyo. Without further ado, please give Dr. Bloom a applause and welcome him to the University of the West. Dr. Phillip.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul, for your introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to have a chance to talk about the Waterland Retreat. My talk will kind of have three parts. I thought I would begin by talking about the ritual in general, and then we'll focus on two specific meetings related to it. We'll be thinking in particular about how the ritual has been depicted and how those kind of depictions tell us about what's going on in the ritual that we might not actually be able to see with our eyes. So as probably everyone is well aware, the Waterland Dharma Assembly is about to be performed at Shilai Temple starting this weekend. It will be a 2-week long ritual, and it's a really major event. It involves bringing together all of the beings of the cosmos. It involves making offerings to them, bathing them, bestowing precepts, and it's just an incredibly involved affair. And so I'll kind of take you through some, kind of basics about the ritual first, and basics about how the ritual is performed today, and then we'll also look a little bit at how it was performed differently in the past. So the Waterland Retreat, I often will say Waterland Retreat, that's just, it goes by many different names: Shrilu Papai, Shrilu Jai, Shrilu Play, Shrilu Bong. Depending on the time period you're looking at, it has all sorts of different names. So Waterland Retreat, Waterland Dharma Assembly, it's a ritual of cosmic assembly. We know that it's been performed definitely since about the 9th century in China. It can be performed over various periods of time. It can be performed in a single day. We have actual liturgies from Korea for single day variants of the ritual. Typically, today it's performed over 7 days. It can be performed over 2 weeks, or it can be performed over several months. It involves bringing together all of the beings of the cosmos, both Buddhist beings and non-Buddhist beings. And they're really brought together to kind of physically assemble within the ritual arena. And it's called Waterland Dharma Assembly because it's bringing together all beings of water and land, as well as the air of the body. The ritual has some kind of basic components. These spirits are brought together, they're summoned, offerings are made to them. Typically, they're bathed. The participants go through acts of repentance. Precepts are bestowed on beings who are not already considered followers of the Buddha. And ultimately, those newly kind of converted beings are sent off to be reborn into a higher path of existence. It's a ritual of universal salvation. By performing this ritual, really everyone, all beings in the cosmos, are led toward awakening. But it actually, in the past, it was particularly performed for the benefit of the ghosts of people who died in difficult circumstances. So if a person died and wasn't able to be buried properly, one way to ensure that their spirit could be sent off for a proper rebirth would be to perform the Waterland Retreat. And particularly in the past, so like in the Song dynasties, the ritual was often performed for the benefit of people killed during warfare. So battlefield casualties or civilian casualties couldn't necessarily be buried properly. So after a battle, very often an emperor would actually sponsor this ritual to take care of the people who had died during a war. Today, it's typically performed to benefit deceased family members. And I think one final general point about the ritual is that it's very contingent, so it can change a lot, and it has changed a lot over time. It really changes in response to the needs or the desires or even the financial needs of the sponsors. So if a person can only perform a single day variant of the ritual, that's okay. If they can afford to perform a 7-day variant, even better. And the different kind of the basic structure of the ritual stays the same, but certain elements can be moved around depending on the needs or financial needs of the sponsor. So today, if you visit Shilai Temple in the next 2 weeks, you'll see that they're performing it in kind of two general spaces. There's a space called the inner altar that is the main hall of the ritual proper. And then there are spaces called the outer altars. So in some of the subsidiary buildings of the temple, they actually perform different rites. So it's in the inner altar that the water lamp ritual itself is performed. And then in the outer altars, a number of other rituals that kind of bolster the power of the water lamp ritual itself are enacted. So these outer altars include actually some very complex rituals like the Great Repentance of the they also include recitations of particular sutras like the Avatapasaka Sutra, the Hayajin, the Shramgama Sutra, and also the Lotus Sutra and Pure Land Sutras. There are also some kind of simpler repentance rites that are performed in the outer altars. But the Waterland ritual itself proper is what's going on in the inner altar. So that's really what I'll be talking about today. So at Shilai Temple, the inner altar is the interior of the main hall, where the three Buddhas are enshrined permanently. And for this particular ritual performance, the three main Buddhas are surrounded by paintings of all of the beings of the cosmos. There are, I think, something like 96 paintings, slightly fewer than 100 paintings in total. And they depict everyone from Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to hungry ghosts, to the ghosts of deceased humans, the animals, as well as some Taoist and Confucian figures. It's really the entirety of the cosmos that's brought together. So when you enter into this space as a monastic or as a worshiper, you really are surrounded by the entirety of the cosmos for this very in this defined period, 1 to 2 week period of time. And rather interestingly, too, besides the paintings, the names of all of these beings are written on placards that are placed in front of the paintings, and then offerings are placed in front of them. It's an incredibly elaborate, incredibly precise, and incredibly beautiful, I think, arrangement for the ritual. So the ritual is performed according to what some scholars would call a guest host model of ritual. I'm going to adjust the microphone. So the guest host model is it's basically the idea of inviting an honored guest to a banquet. So if you imagine the temple as a banquet site, and you imagine the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and ghosts as the guests, and the monastics as the hosts, you kind of get the idea of what goes on. So first, the ritual arena, the main hall, is purified and adorned. Then the guest invitations are issued to the guests. I think in typical Buddhist practice, invitations are done through oral incantations. You say the name of the guest, but you also offer incense. In the Waterland retreat, you do all of that, plus you write letters. And sometimes you even write mandates or orders to tell the Taoist beings to show up at the ritual too, so that they can benefit from these recitations of the Dharma. Then once all of these beings are assembled, you offer feasts to everyone who has assembled. And when the feasting is done, feasting might include bathing as well as food offerings and incense offerings. Typically, you'll make requests of the guests. So in most rituals, you would invite the Buddhas to watch over, for example, the repentance that the officiants undergo, or you might invite the Buddhas to watch over the bestowal of food to hungry ghosts. And similarly, you are kind of inviting the hungry ghosts themselves to receive the Dharma. And then after that kind of, it's almost like a transaction. Almost after that transaction between guest and host has taken place, you dismiss the guests and let them return to their place. And the cosmos, and in particular, for beings that have been converted through these rituals, we send them off, for example, to the pyramid. The Waterland retreat more or less follows this 5-part model, but it does so in a much more, at a much grander scale and with much more detail in each of these steps. And rather amazingly, the Shilai Temple website provides kind of the step-by-step photographic account of the 2017 performance of the ritual. So those are the images that you'll be seeing on the screen. I think they're really effective in kind of getting us into the spirit of what the ritual is like. So it really does begin by sealing and purifying the inner altar. That you can see the officiant in the center has a basin of pure water that is spreading around, really spreading around the borders of this hall to kind of protect it from the baleful influences outside of the space and to sanctify the interior. Then invitations are issued. So actually the first way that invitations are issued is by asking these 4 messengers who are mounted on horseback to go off throughout the cosmos to send invitations to different kinds of spirits. So there are 4 of them. One is for enlightened beings, one is for celestial beings, one is for earthly beings, and one is for underworld beings. So you're able to bring beings, everyone from the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to the denizens of the hells together, thanks to these 4 messengers. And further, a banner is hung outside of the temple to announce that this is the spot where everyone should assemble. Then I would call it kind of a more traditional kind of Buddhist invitation rite is undertaken. So mantras are recited, to a certain extent, mudras are performed, and oral incantations are recited to bring down the saintly beings, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, into the ritual arena to begin overseeing the rite. Then offerings are made to them, in this case, food offerings, as well as bathing and clothing. And that kind of gets us through the first 2 acts of the ritual, and then things kind of turn their attention toward the beings who need to be saved through this, through the rite. That begins by enlisting certain devas, Indra, Odisha-chan, and sorry, excuse me. You begin by inviting 2 devas to issue pardons to other beings in the cosmos. So essentially, you're asking these 2 devas to help bring together all of the unenlightened beings and to forgive them of any past transgressions. So it's actually a very bureaucratic kind of procedure. It involves quite literally a lot of writing and a lot of recitation of very formalized, almost legal documents. Then those unenlightened beings are invited again through incantations and incense offering, as well as through written forms. They're assembled in the ritual arena, and precept, kind of the standard lay precepts are bestowed on these unenlightened beings who have assembled. This is actually one of the quite distinctive features of the Waterland retreat, this bestowal of precepts, particularly on the deceased. It's really a way of saving people who might not have been able to find the path during their own. Then offerings are made to these unenlightened beings, and through this process of offering as well as precepts bestowal, the idea really is that they are sent on a path toward awakening. And then there's a series of final offerings, both of food as well as of incense, to conclude the ritual and to ensure that everyone really is properly seen. And the culmination, I think, is the burning of a boat carrying placards representing all of these different, particularly the deceased people, to carry them to the pure land. There are also, again, oral incantations that are used to send Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, other beings back to the all the places in the cosmos. So it's with this that the ritual really ends. The the sequence that I've just described and the sequence that's most commonly performed in temples throughout China, Taiwan, and overseas Chinese communities today is based on this text. It's called the Synthesized Liturgy for the Waterland Assembly, the Shortly. It's a text that was actually first published around 1924. But it's based on earlier texts going back to about the 13th century to 1260. And in this text, there's quite a lot of information about the history of the rite itself. So typically the Waterland Assembly is said to have been originated by Emperor Wu of the Liang Dynasty. This is a claim that's made in almost every liturgy for the Waterland Retreat from about the 11th century onward. There's actually not evidence outside of the Waterland materials themselves that Emperor Wu necessarily created the Waterland Retreat, but we do have other sources that show that he was performing similar rituals in the sense of rituals of a similar scale. And involving similar arrays of deities. However, the idea that you would bestow precepts on deceased family members is actually something that didn't really emerge in China until a couple of centuries after Emperor Wu's death. So he was doing things sort of in the vein of the Waterland Assembly, but it probably was very different from the modern. The actual term, like Waterland Assembly, doesn't appear in any texts until the late Tang Dynasty, so about the 9th century. There are a number of stelae where this term Shui starts to appear. And so we're fairly certain that by the 9th century, the ritual was being performed throughout China. And certainly by the 11th century, we have quite a lot of evidence that it was being performed in multiple regions of China, and actually by followers of multiple sects of Buddhism. There are a number of regional variants, a number of sectarian variants that I'll talk about in a minute. And today, as everyone here knows, it's still a very important ritual in China and Taiwan and overseas Chinese communities. It's also very important in Korea. The liturgy made its way to Korea at least by the 13th century, if not before. And within Korea itself, a number of different variants have emerged that are actually quite different from how the ritual is performed in China, in Chinese communities today. So I wasn't sure how technical to get, so I'm going to be somewhat technical. There are a number of So there are different variants of the ritual, but they tend to vary in two major ways. So the way that we typically perform it today is done in a bipartite manner. There's the upper hall of all of the enlightened beings, and then there's the lower hall of the unenlightened beings. In the past, up until like the 18th century, it actually was more common to have three parts. The enlightened beings above, the celestial, really more like Taoist beings in the middle, and then everyone else, all of the unenlightened people down the way. And then even within that, there are a number of variations. So the earliest really, I think, the earliest variant of the ritual for which we have very good textual sources emerged in Sichuan in the late 11th century, so around 1071. And rather interestingly, so we have accounts of two different Sichuanese versions of this ritual from the 11th century, one by a person named Yao, one by Su Shi, the famous writer and politician. And rather interestingly, both of these earliest variants seem to have been composed by lay people. So that's, I think, very interesting that a ritual of this scale would have been possibly conceptualized, or at least recorded first by the people rather than monastics. The other, another kind of descendant of that early Sichuanese practice appears in Yunnan, and we have a ritual manual that survives from 1379, recording that early Yunnan variant. It's actually, in content, it feels much more esoteric than these early Sichuanese versions, but they share a lot of similarities in terms of how they conceptualize the cosmos. And in all of these variants from Yunnan and Sichuan, they divide the cosmos into upper and lower. They also divide each of those halls into 8 seats. So there are 8 kinds of enlightened beings and 8 kinds of unenlightened. In the 13th century, among Tiantai monk named Zhu compiled a version of the Waterland retreat using 24 seats. He felt that the way the ritual was being performed in his time was overly complicated. And so he decided to take inspiration from the Sichuanese practitioners and reduce the number of seats and really focus on just these 24. His version of the ritual, actually, the earliest manuscript that we have for it survives in Korea. There's a 15th century version that's still extant. But it was revised in probably around 1600 by the Pure Land monk Zhu. And it's really Zhu Hong's revisions that are the basis for what we do today with the Shirley. And so, yeah, I explained it right here. So Zhipan's liturgy gets revised by Zhu Hong. Zhu Hong's liturgy gets revised by Yingguang into the Shirley that we use. Yeah. That's a good question. Thank you. And I should have said, please feel free to stop me at any time. As I said, I wasn't sure how technical or what to get, so please stop me. Seat is really just a term for the tablets that are used. So actually, if you go to Shilai Temple or others, you'll see it says like Di Shi, Di Shi. And that's referring to that little spot for the deities. The way it's done today, each seat has usually 10 beings. So the Di Shi, the first seat, actually has 10 Buddhas. The second seat actually has 10 or 12 Bodhisattvas. But it's yeah, I hope that makes sense. The tablets themselves are called highway, but the terms are kind of interchangeable. Yeah. Again, the way it's done today, the first seat is the Buddhas, the second seat are the Bodhisattvas, third seat, I can't remember right now. I think it's Arhats, Allahan. And it's basically a descending order of awakening. So the most awakened at top. And then it gets a little bit fuzzy because at a certain point you get into the human realm, and so they include, for example, the previous abbots of the temple would be a particular seat, or the innovators of the Waterland ritual itself are a particular seat. And then with the unenlightened beings, there's also a hierarchy. Typically, the Taoist deities will be above, animals and hell dwellers and hungry ghosts. And then there's a whole separate or series of seats for people who died in different ways. Thank you. That's a good question too. So, in how do I explain? um, the in the Song Dynasty and then into the Ming, there were kind of different sectarian traditions. So Chan is probably one that's still familiar to most people today. There also is the Tiantai tradition that focuses more on the Lotus Sutra. In the Song Dynasty, there also was an esoteric tradition, really Nijia, that it's a little bit similar to what in Japan you see with the Shingon or Tendai schools today, where there's the use of mandalas. There's a lot of, you know, the, there are techniques that are transmitted outside of text just through master-disciple relationships. There's a lot of visualization of one's own body kind of merging with the bodies of particular deities. It's just a very different approach to Buddhist practice, probably from what most of us are familiar with today. And with this Yunnanese manual, when you go through how they arrange the different altars and when you look at the different kinds of words that they're using, it just feels very different from the other temples that they're in. So my feeling has been that it's more of an esoteric tradition, whereas something like the manual that we typically use today is more in a Chentai. If that helps. So those are, that gives you an overview of the varieties, the variations of the ritual that exists just within that bipartite structure that is what we actually still use today. On the other hand, the way the ritual was most commonly performed between about the 12th century and the 18th century was using a tripartite division of the cosmos. So originally around the year 1196, a Chan monk named Zongzi, who today is actually most famous for compiling the first set of monastic regulations. He also compiled a liturgy for the Waterline retreat. And his liturgy was adapted a century or so later into this thing called the Liturgy for the Retreat of All Beings of Heaven and Earth, the Netherworld and this world, and Water and Land. Tiandi Niyang Shredo Niyang. That seems to have been the most common, most popular way of performing this ritual through much of the preceding centuries. We have many, many, many copies of this manual that still survive today. But for reasons that I don't understand, it completely fell out of practice prior to the 20th century. And what's, at least to me, kind of interesting about these manuals is that they do tend to reflect a more Chan or Huayan orientation to the performance of the liturgy. Zongzi, for example, is very definitely a Chan patriarch. And then in this liturgy, we see a lot of quotations from Huayan as well as some of Chan masters' commentaries on different sutras. So there's a kind of different feel to the text, and also I think there's probably a slightly different way that the ritual is performed compared to what we do. Avatam Saka with Huayan. And try more about its purpose. So having said all of that and gone into that detail, really all of these variations still share these same basic traits. It's still always a ritual of cosmic assembly. It still always involves summoning, offering, bathing, repentance, bestowal, and rebirth. It's still really focused on universal salvation, particularly saving ghosts who are upset for whatever reason. And it's also really adaptable. And I think the fact that so many different variants exist really show you that historically, at least, this has been a very it's a ritual that can change. And so what's, I think, kind of visually exciting is that you actually start to see all of this in the paintings that survive from the ritual. So because this ritual involves summoning everyone in the cosmos, it's actually been probably the most important impetus for the production of Buddhist art in China throughout the past 1,000 years. There are quite truly thousands, if not tens of thousands, of paintings that still survive from the 13th century onward, specifically created to perform this ritual. In Japan, uh, there are actually a number of 13th century paintings that were probably used in variants involving the bipartite structure. I'm showing you just a couple of samples here. And if you were to take the two paintings on the left and compare them to what is being used at Shirai Temple today, you would see that the structure and even some of the figures are identical. The painting in the middle actually is showing you all of the founders of the Waterland retreat. There's Ananda and the Hungry Ghost King at the top. And then at the bottom, there's Emperor Wu, there's Susha, there's Yangla, there's Jupan, among others. And all of those figures are directly depicted in one or two of the scrolls used in the variant that we contain. On the other hand, we also have many, many paintings used in the tripartite division version of the ritual. There are paintings in scroll formats like this, but there are also mural paintings like this. And this mural painting is one that I really love because it's structured truly in a tripartite manner. So at the very top, sorry, at the very top, you have the three Buddhas. In the middle, you have a bunch of celestial deities with a monastic officiant in the middle. And then at the bottom, you have mundane unenlightened spirits. So the structure of the mural is really telling you something about the structure of the ritual that is performed. So before I continue, if you all have any questions, I'm happy to take them, or we can just continue. That's going to be that topic in just a moment. Actually, good question. Any other question? That's a very curious question. What I have one purely unsubstantiated speculation. That is, in the 11th century, there was really a lot of early interest in Buddhism, and there are also a number of examples of white people writing their own literature. So it seems like there must have somehow been more openness to lay people performing ritual on their own than you find in later periods. But why that exactly is the case, I'm not sure. The other topic I'm really interested in is arhats, Mohan, and actually the one liturgy that we have from the 11th century for summoning arhats also was written by a lay person. And yet arhats today are something we really associate with monastic life. So there just must have been something different about the environment for that period that resulted in lay people taking such kind of command of their own practice. Okay. Please. Yep. Yeah, that will be the third part of the talk if if we make it there. That's a good question. That's a really difficult question, but I'll try to get to it. Third part. So we, sure.
So what kind of land the rich is focusing on? You know, the very curious about.
So in the textual sources, there are two different explanations for the name. One is just simply that it's involving all beings of the realms of water and all beings of the realm of land, and actually all beings of the realm of air. So it's meant it's just referring to elements. Um, Another explanation that appears in a 12th or 13th century text is that certain beings who are summoned to the ritual gain sustenance from water, whereas certain beings gain sustenance from land. And so again, you're trying to include everyone. So you're including everyone who takes their sustenance from both water and land. Those are the two main explanations, at least in the textual sources. I actually think this very long name under the Shangshi, this liturgy for retreat of all beings in heaven and earth, netherworld and this world and water and land. That's actually probably the most comprehensive and complete name, because it's insisting on the fact that you include heavenly beings, earthly beings, kind of deceased or underworld beings, beings in this world, as well as the water. And since the ritual really does focus on deceased souls, I think it's important to include that term in that area. So I have a little bit of an interlude to kind of give a conceptual background for the paintings that we're discussing in a moment. And it very much echoes the introduction earlier in terms of the way that ritual functions that kind of bring you outside of daily life and to focus your attention through a variety of different kind of physical as well as mental means. And I think this photograph that I showed earlier really captures the excitement of a ritual like the Waterland Retreat. You know, there's incense, there's food, there are candles. You can see the officiants are chanting. One of the officiants even has a microphone. There's so many different colors and textures, so many different sounds, smells. There's actually a lot of sensory stimulation in most rituals, but particularly in the Waterland Retreat. And I think this is doing a couple of things. So I like to think about ritual as existing in what I call a multisensory matrix. And I think ritual usually has two parts to it that we separate just in order to talk about them, but these two parts are always together. So there's a physical dimension and there's also a mental dimension. The physical dimension is pretty obvious. So you have a ritual performance. That ritual performance typically stimulates all of your senses. So there's the smell of incense, there's the sounds of chanting and music, there are tastes, either of tea or foods, there's sights, there's visual spectacle, there's also, I think, the sense of bodily presence that's very different from what you have in daily life. And all of these different sensory stimuli really are functioning to remove both the officiants and the lay people from their experience of daily life. So through all of this sensory stimulation, for a week or two, you're brought into a totally different realm where all kinds of different transformations are possible. But at the same time, there's also a mental dimension to all of this. And I like this photograph of an officiant in a Waterland ritual in China, because you can see that he's making an incense offering. He's surrounded by paintings and textiles and colors. But you can also tell from his posture that there's something very specific going on in his mind. So if we think about the mental dimensions of this sensory matrix, again, we start with the ritual performance. That's stimulating the efficient senses. but the stimulation of sense actually has an effect on the mind. So, for example, smells like incense or sounds like chanting or bells or clappers all typically will become cues to perform visualizations. So there's really a kind of choreography where physical sensation ends up affecting what's going on here. And this is detailed very specifically in the liturgies. So in the Shmiri Great, you can see it will say, one monk is meant, one officiant is meant to clatter a cymbal or to strike a bell. And then another monk is meant to immediately begin a visualization whose content might also be pronounced orally by yet another officiant. So there's this constant interplay between the physical and the mental. And what I think is amazing about painting is that painting becomes a way to reveal some of that mental activity to everyone, both officiants and lay people alike. So for the rest of the talk, I'll be talking about two paintings that I think do this in a really interesting way. The painting on the right is an actual depiction of one moment in a Waterland ritual, and the painting on the left is a mural that was created specifically for use in a Waterland ritual. So we'll start with this painting. I'll just kind of lead you through it first and then talk about the content a bit more. So at first glance, you can probably see there are like two clearly differentiated zones in this painting. There's a background and a foreground. In the foreground, you have this depiction of arhats or monks. They actually are arhats, but they're depicted as monks. There are 5 of them. They have an attendant. They have ritual paraphernalia. There are candles. There's an incense burner. There's a clapper. There's also a text, probably a manual in front of the main officiant. They're on some kind of platform. It seems to be outdoors. And it's this very bright, very orderly, very kind of precise scene. If we look up into the background, you have a totally different kind of visual effect and totally different image. The background is kind of muddled. It's kind of messy. It almost seems like it's transforming. The more you stare at it, the more all of the lines start to flow together, and it becomes kind of confusing. It seems like there's some kind of tree here. There are some crannies in the tree where ghostly figures are just barely visible. And then there are some banks of mist, and then a variety of different figures seem to be emerging from the mist. So we'll go through precisely what's going on in just a moment, but I should just tell you this is one of a set of 100 paintings. It's one panel in a set of depictions of the 500 arhats. So each panel depicts 5 arhats, and the arhats are shown doing everything from kind of mundane monastic activities like eating dinner or bathing to translating sutras. Sometimes they're shown receiving offerings from different deities throughout the cosmos. But most interestingly, the arhats are also shown performing, or at least engaging in ritual. So one of these paintings shows the arhats being summoned to an offering. One of these paintings, the one that we're focusing on, shows the arhats performing the Waterland retreat, and then another one shows them going to some kind of banquet. These are paintings that were created around 1178 or 1188 in southeastern China in Ningbo. Today, most of them are held in Japan on a Daitokuji temple. 10 of them are in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and 2 of them are at the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. They've probably been in Japan since the 13th century or 14th century, but they were originally created in China, and we know exactly which temple they were created for. The painters signed their names on some of them. They have quite a lot of information about the donors and painters. And just to give you a sense of how big they are, you can see how they're mounted. And you can imagine that if you hung 100 of these scrolls in a hall, it would really be like you were entering the realm of the arhats yourself. It would have been a totally mesmerizing experience. So if we let's take a closer look and figure out what really is happening here. So as we saw, there's this senior arhat monk seated, ritual manual. There's an incense burner, the candles, the clapper. He's surrounded by 4 other monks who are holding their hands in gestures of reverence. And then 1 or 2 of them kind of seem to be looking off into the distance as though they're recognizing that something is going on beyond the boundary of this platform. Then again, we look at the background, we kind of got the sense that there are figures emerging from the mists, and hopefully this image really helps you to see. But you can probably see that there are some figures in the robes of scholar officials. There are some figures wearing armor. There are some figures who are totally emaciated. So these are all different kinds of ghostly figures, a variety of different statuses. And they really are emerging out of the mists. But I think what's really interesting about this, to get to your question, is that they're painted very differently from the arhats. So the arhats are rendered in the brilliant polychrome mineral pigments on top of the silk. It's meant to be as vivid and bright as possible. And the ghosts are painted in a very, very different way. It's not just that they're painted in light colors. They're actually probably painted on the back side of the silk. So one of the really interesting things about East Asian painting is that silk is woven. So you can weave silk in a lot of ways, but one way that you can do it is so that there's quite a lot of space between the warp and weft fibers. And that's what you're seeing on the right. So you can see the fibers of the silk, and then you can see that there are pigments. And that pigment can be, because the silk is so open, you can apply pigment to both sides. So if you apply pigment to the front, it's very, very vivid. If you apply pigment to the back, it will be less vivid. So you can create very subtle coloration, effects of coloration. You can also apply it to both sides, and that actually creates like a sandwich, so that the pigments adhere to each other, so that when you roll or unroll a scroll, the pigments will be more stable. And here you can see both the front and the back of the 13th century painting. So on the left is the front. You can see that the robes of some of the arhats are quite bright. And then on the right, you can see the backside of the silk, where you can see that it's only in certain spots that pigments have been applied to the back. And that's, in this case, it's really to ensure more vivid colors. They apply pigments to both sides to really heighten the bright colors that you perceive as a viewer. Here are a couple of other examples. That what you're seeing on the right is just a detail of this book that the monk is holding. And in this case, they've applied white pigment to the backside of the silk, so that when you look at the painting from the front, you just see this very kind of ivory, faint white color. And then they used ink over top. And then here's another example of the pigmentation of a monk's robe, where there's a white pigment that's applied to the back, and then green and blue that's applied to the front. And so the effect again is you can create very subtle gradients using this technique. So I think what's going on in this painting is that the ghosts are actually being depicted on the backside of the silk. So it's as though they really are coming into being from the backside of the silk toward the front. And when you look very closely, you can see that kind of at the top of the silk, of the composition, the pigmentation is less intense, and toward the bottom it's more intense. So it's really is the ghosts are emerging at this very moment, right before your eyes. And I think this is amazing because it parallels exactly what happens during the water retreat, during one moment in the water retreat. I mentioned a moment ago that these paintings were created between 1178 and 1188 near the city of Ningbo in southeastern China. We also have a manual for the Waterland retreat that was compiled around 1260 in Ningbo. So the very same region, more or less the same time. And if we look at that manual and specifically at the rite for basically for summoning the beings of the lower form, for summoning the unenlightened beings, we can kind of make sense of this painting in a compelling way. So I guess I would just start by noting that in the 1260 variant of this rite, and even in the variant of the rite that's performed today, for example, at Shirai Temple, ritual activity is primarily divided between two officiants. So there's a figure called the cantor that we all buy, and there's a figure called the ritual master Fashi. And in these manuals, the cantor is responsible for everything that's external. So he's responsible for reciting oral incantations. He's responsible sometimes for bells and drums and clappers. These sometimes will be involved in leading lay people through activities. Everything that this person is doing really is externally focused. It's kind of physical and sensory. Meanwhile, everything that the ritual master is doing is more internal. The ritual master is primarily responsible for visualization. So for generating images mentally throughout the ritual performance. But what's really interesting is that these figures work together. So the cantor will, recite a poem and then utter a symbol, and then that will be a cue for the ritual master to start the visualization. So, for example, actually, let me take you through the rite specifically for summoning ghosts, like we see in the background of this painting. So with this particular rite, again, it begins by purifying the ritual space, and burn incense, sprinkle pure water, offer flowers. Then the cantor recites a homily on summoning. And what's interesting about this homily is that he talks quite a lot about how senses interact with the summoning of these beings. So he particularly like this, it says, will summon the ranks of human slavers and ashiras and the clouds of ghosts, animals, and hell dwellers with form, scent, and flavor. Their hunger-ridden guts will be sated. They'll leave the heat of torment, again pure and cruel, abandoning fear, and bringing peace. So the cantor is telling you exactly what's about to happen. We're going to make all of these offerings, and we're going to summon all of these unenlightened beings into this space so that they can be saved. So once the cantor has done that, you actually begin summoning the beings. There's an invocation of each general category. So, for example, we say, we're now ready to summon all of the animals, and then you summon 10 different examples of animals. We're now ready to begin summoning the hungry ghosts, and specific examples of hungry ghosts. And at the end of each list of names, they say this line: we pray that they'll not be confused about their original nature. And on this night, at this hour, let them hear some first night and Sunday. So the act of summoning all of these unenlightened beings is taking place at night, just like we see in the painting with these ghosts emerging from the mist at night. So then the cantor will offer incense and flowers and will clatter together symbols, and that is a cue for the ritual master to start the visualization. So the ritual master visualizes that the innumerable masses come from the void to abide within the treasure palace and pavilions of the pure flat path. They visualize that the innumerable masses of hungry ghosts either come from the four directions or arrive from below the earth. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in this painting, this notion that the ritual master is visualizing hungry ghosts coming from the four directions or arriving from the way. So you asked earlier about the difference between depicting ghosts and Buddhas. Ghosts tend to be depicted in mists. Buddhas tend to be depicted in clouds. So clouds are celestial, they're bringing them down. Ghosts are mists, are terrestrial, and it's within that terrestrial context, the hungry ghosts are emerging. And that's exactly what's going on in this movie. You have these ghosts emerging from terrestrial. No, the so the sprinkling of pure water is to seal the ritual space, and then there's a separate rite actually of bathing the spirits. Sometimes you actually will create back, with large basins of water to, and will visualize the spirits entering into the bath, receiving new clothes, putting on the new clothes, and then coming back into the hall, having been fully purified. Um, yeah, and I think if you go to Shilai Temple in 2 weeks, there is a separate space for bathing the spirits in the course of the ritual. Okay. So I think you're getting the point. This painting really is depicting that process of summoning the spirits, and in particular, it's trying to show us what's going on inside the ritual. So this visualization of the spirits emerging from the mists. And then the rite actually concludes with mantras, so with Sanskrit phrases that are meant to really solidify the process of summoning. And again, even after reciting the mantras, there's again a visualization. During, it's actually quite interesting. So the ritual master will envision that all of these ghosts have shown up in the ritual arena with their animals, all sorts of beings. And then they actually visualize that the non-human beings take human form. So the animals become human in order to undergo the rest of the ritual. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of kind of what's going on during the water line retreat, at least during the summoning of unenlightened being. I just really love this painting because it takes us to the heart of ritual activity in a way that not many paintings do. I, yeah, I love this painting more than anything. So do you have any questions about what I've discussed so far? Please. So the in a sense, it's like the level of detail varies. So for example, a one-day waterland retreat will involve the summoning and offering and bathing and precepts, but you might not summon every being quite as specifically as you do when you're performing the 7-day bathing. And I think with Shilai Temple this time, they're doing the 2-week variant because there's quite a lot of activity in the outer altars that's it's a little bit separate from what's going on in the inner altar that's actually the waterland retreat itself. So there's still the core of the waterland retreat, but then there are lots of other activities that are actually more extensive than usual. And so I think that's why they're doing a 2-week variation. In the past, I know that there are examples from the Yuan and Ming dynasties where there they would spend something like 3 months performing a water lamp retreat. And I don't exactly know how they would expand the ritual to fill such a long period of time. I'm really not sure. A couple of relations. So, in the way that it's performed today, the Huayan is often recited in the outer altar. So, in the inner altar, you have the water lamp repeat proper. In the outer altar, the Huayan is either recited or paged through. Read it. Yeah, I misspoke. They read the Huayan. But also, kind of doctrinally, some of the content the Waterland liturgy is taken from Huayan contexts. The Huayan content is more obvious in other variants of the ritual, particularly in the variant that was performed like in northern China from the 13th to the 18th centuries. There are a number of quotations of the Huayan Jing itself, and also of liturgies compiled by uh, mostly by some Huayan. Yeah, but so in this, at least in this variant of the ritual, they say that the ritual master is meant to envision animals and certain ghosts taking human form, and specifically it says like the form of it's either a 2-year-old or a 7-year-old baby. Um, so I think the idea really is that these unenlightened beings are being completely reborn through this process of through the process of the ritual. And that's interesting. A great question. Thank you. So, um, I think what's really difficult about working on liturgy in general is that what constitutes a liturgy, like the actual text, can vary so dramatically. So, with the modern variant, which I really grateful about, it's very explicit. It tells every member of the monastic personnel quite specifically what they're meant to be. But with other variants, they're not so explicit. So, for example, with that Northern Chinese variant of the ritual, there are very few explicit instructions about um, visualization. But what that probably means is that visualization was taught separately from the text. And so with the Yunnan variant, there actually are different volumes of the text intended for different monastic members of the personnel. So whenever we're looking at variants of these rituals, you get an incomplete picture, but each time it's incomplete in a different way. But most likely all, you know, basically since the soul, there's always been quite a lot of visualization in any kind of repentance or post-pleading rites, which is what That's a very interesting question too. So one of the ritual master's other functions is actually to lead the lay people in making things. So the lay people are constantly being involved in physical activity. They're never given specific instructions, at least in the texts, about the mental component. But they are always meant to be physically engaged with the groups. I'd be very curious in contemporary practice how, what the interaction is like between the monastic officials and the lay participants. But in the texts, it's really focused on what it is. I'm the wrong person to ask, but actually, Professor Monchel Yang at USC, the University of Southern California, has just written a book about this. She's worked on the relationship between Buddhist, particularly liturgy, and the writing of drama during the Ming Dynasty. She would be a great person to invite to speak about that question, because it's a very important question. Yes. Yeah. 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 Um, that's a very complex question, I think, because there's there's also the question of how Taoist ritual interacted with the waterland, and also how Taoist ritual affects local um, with local ritual practices, but also local thematic practices. And I just haven't really, my specialty really is painting rather than these people.
Because when we go into the inner quarter, it's all around by hundreds of paintings, and at the same time, the monks they chanting. I just when I first saw the paintings, I have a question because I know most of the paintings, the water and land Dharma fountain paintings, they don't have the name for the painters. They don't. But since they don't have that the chance to, I don't know if it's a chance or is a regulation, they are not allowed to have the names, or that's the group work. But I have a curiosity that just like you said, that some of the monastic, before they perform the Dharma function, they will be taught about the texture. I mean, the text, the words. But what about the painters? I don't think they have chance to get familiar with all the text. If they don't have the chance to know the texture, how can they match their contents of their paintings into these Dharma functions?
Yeah,
That's my curiosity.
that's a very important question. Thank you. I can just, I don't know much about contemporary practices, but I can talk a little bit about the past. So typically, a painting like this, we know that it was produced in a workshop. The the painters actually signed about 50 of the 100 scrolls. And typically, each scroll was sponsored by a different person, actually some monastics too, but was sponsored by a different person. So many of the paintings actually do have an inscription on it. So it says, Zhou Qichang of Wei painted this, and then so-and-so from such and such a village donated something to paint this painting in order to bring benefit to their family, something like that. And when you start looking at the paintings from an art historian's perspective, you can kind of tell that there were probably different people involved in crafting the image. So typically, the head of the painting studio would create the composition and do basic outlines. Then an assistant would come and do all of the pigmentation. And then the painting master would again come back and do all of the final outlines to finalize the image. The way that they were actually composing the images, though, it was probably a very complex process, and we don't have great documentation, but typically the way we imagine it is that the painters were working primarily from earlier paintings. So their studio would have had a set of images that they copied over and over and over again. And actually, with this particular set of paintings, there are at least 2 copies, not pure copies, but they're kind of adaptations that exist, so that we do know that these models were circulating. And but then the question is, who originated the models? And again, we don't have great documentation, but in places like Finland, where there are the large cave mural programs, there is some evidence that there would have been an interaction between sort of a monastic advisor and the painter. There would be a monastic advisor, probably a lay sponsor, and then the painting studio. And there must have been some sorts of discussions that took place in order to define all of these compositions. What's really, I think, to me, amazing about this particular set of paintings is that they include amazing detail about monastic life, like the certain things about the way they depict the bathhouse, for example, accord very precisely with 12th century descriptions, 12th century monastic regulations. And they also accord very precisely with certain legends that were recorded in early Buddhist texts. So there was definite knowledge on the part of the painters that they presumably gained through interactions with the monastic community. I think that was probably what was going on. Please. Those are great questions. So the question about blessing, with this particular set, I'm not certain. We have very good evidence in multiple time periods, from about the year 500 onward, that images of Buddhas or Bodhisattvas would have their eyes opened. There's a specific ritual for opening for opening the eyes of a new image, and that's usually done, for main images of Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. It's something that's still done commonly today. For a set of paintings like this, I think it's less certain. I kind of doubt. I think there would have been a celebration when the images were complete, but I don't know if each arhat would individually have their eyes open. in terms of preserving the paintings, so um, something like the Waterland retreat or the offering to the 500 arhats is something that a temple would usually only do once a year at most. It's possible to do a Waterland retreat more than once a year, but it's very difficult. So the paintings probably weren't used that frequently. They would just be displayed for a week or two at a time and rolled up. And these paintings are stored in simple boxes of colonial wood, which has it naturally resists pests. It's watertight and it resists pests. These particular paintings have been in Japan for the past 700 years. And we know that they were probably used once a year. So they also, once a year, the temple where they were held would actually unroll all of their paintings just to let them air out, try to reduce the possibility of mold or to reduce the possibility of other pests infecting them. But of course, they're also sacred objects. So the people taking care of them really, prized them and tried to care with them, all of them, right? They've been able to survive in remarkably good condition. The other thing, though, is that paintings do have to be remounted periodically. These particular paintings we know were last remounted about 150 years ago. And sometimes the mounters will actually leave inscriptions on the back of the painting to tell you when they were last remounted. With this set too, there are some strips of paper that the mounters would leave inside of the box. So we know that they were remounted in like 1860 something, and previously it had been 1750 something. So with temple treasures, sometimes there are very good records that will tell us about that. But, yeah. I'm actually not certain. I've been to a couple of temples when they do the annual errands. One temple I went to did it in June, I think. One did it, this temple does it in October, one does it in November. And they've been doing these airings for the past 300 years or so. They've actually always been tourist attractions. They're guidebooks to the city of Kyoto from 1700 that talk about these temple airings. But I don't actually know if they perform some sort of service at the same time. I assume there must be some simple service involved, but I've never actually read about it. Oh, wow. Oh, that's fascinating. That's amazing. That's good to know. Thank you. So I will, if you don't mind taking the notes, there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, that gets to a question that was asked. So the other painting I wanted to talk about is actually a mural specifically produced for the performance of the Waterloo retreat. What you're seeing is just one wall of temple building. Of course, the temple building has 4 walls, and they're all painted. The painting was produced between about the late 1350s and the late 1360s. It's a temple called Qingling, so the Green Dragon Temple in Jishan County in Shanxi Province. So it's in southern Shanxi Province. It's a site that, it's protected. It's a historical site today. You can still visit. And this particular hall was the central hall in the monastic compound, and it seems to have been created specifically for the performance of the water retreat. This is the image I showed you earlier, and what's so great about this painting is this mural is that it's really divided into this tripartite structure of the cosmos. So you have the 3 bit over top, the celestial deities in the middle, and the terrestrial spirits. At the bottom, there are also 3 monastic officiants in the very middle. This is, I think, this is either the eastern or western wall of the building, and the opposite wall has almost the same structure. It's just different for those different celestial deities and different terrestrial spirits. And then on the north and south walls are processions of other beings that are coming to assemble underneath the device. So, for example, on the north wall, you have Ananda leading a number of different hungry ghosts as well as ghostly spirits. You have arhats, deceased scholar officials. On the south wall, a procession of different kinds of the ghosts of different kinds of deceased people, as well as Vijayarajas and Thought. And each of the groups of figures is identified with a cartouche. So there's a little inscription that says, these are the ghosts of scholar officials, these are the ghosts of emperors and empresses, these are the ghosts of great Taoists of the past, that sort of thing. And rather interestingly, on both the north and south walls, there are these little messenger figures in between. So here are close-ups of those messengers. You can see that some of they're holding light weapons, they have these kind of light armor, and then they're carrying what look like tablets, but it's actually like a pre-modern Chinese envelope. So it's a box of invitations for the ritual, and each of them is identified. They're associated with different times. So really, this entire hall with its murals is creating a kind of cosmic assembly, and the whole thing is being led by the monastics at center. So you can see that one monk, and he's bowing slightly. In front of him is an altar table with an incense burner and candles. So he really seems to be in the process of bringing together this whole cosmic assembly. And as I mentioned, all of these groups of figures are identified with a little textual inscription, and those groups all match up with one of the variants of the water retreat from the retreat. So I think it's kind of interesting to think a little bit more about these messenger figures, because there's something that aren't really necessary in a purely Buddhist context, and they are something that tell us a little bit more about the history of the water language and the way it interacted with other religious traditions in China. Again, here are the figures. These actually are figures that probably emerged originally in Taoism. There are a number of there are Taoist rituals that are very similar in terms of their scale, and in terms of their function, and even in terms of their ritual proceedings. They're very similar to the water language. They're closest to something called a Fanglu Jai, the rite of the yellow register. it too is a ritual that's it's meant for the benefit of ghosts, particularly the ghosts of people who died in tragic circumstances. But just like the Waterland retreat, this Konijai also involves bringing everyone together into a ritual space and creating, it's almost like a festive environment for salvation. So the conception of salvation is very different. So in a Taoist ritual, typically the first thing you do is actually send out messages throughout the cosmos with written invitations to bring everyone together. And a lot of Taoist ritual is accomplished through the exchange of documents. So much of the Taoist ritualist's life is actually spent copying documents to exchange with communities. And in preparations for the Waterland retreat, actually, Buddhist monastics also are involved in this kind of activity. They end up writing invitations to everyone from Buddhism, Bodhisattvas, and the ghosts, and the ghosts of the deceased. So if we look specifically at the rites of summoning in this Northern Chinese Waterland retreat manual, we find that there are very specific ways of incorporating messengers into the ritual proceedings. The whole ritual actually begins by enlisting these messengers to go and invite the spirits of the cosmos. And I particularly love this kind of poetic passage that links the typical act of offering incense to dispatching messengers. So it says, in the sense of Kampaka burns, penetrating the affairs of the mind, high above blue-green mists, enjoying before auspicious clouds. Incense of 5 fragrances burns, flowing within directions, the luminous spirits carrying mandates and receive offerings. So it's saying, we're offering this incense now to bring the messengers here so that we can send them off to issue their invitations. And really every set of Waterland paintings always includes a depiction of these messengers. And the messengers, throughout these rites, the ritualists are constantly saying, we have to rely on writs and mandates to invite in welcome spirits. We have to depend on those who can promise to present these documents. So throughout the opening of the ritual, there's really an emphasis on the importance of documents and writing to ensure that everyone knows to assemble in the ritual space. Let's skip ahead here a little bit. And say, both in contemporary practice and in the past, those messengers would even be represented with small paper figures. And this is actually from a ghost feeding ritual. It's not from the water. But those figures are burned so that they can be sent off into the cosmos to issue their invitation. So from that perspective, it's just kind of as though the innovators of the ritual were taking the Taoist idiom and incorporating it into this Buddhist rite. But I think it's actually a bit more complex than that. With the Northern Chinese variant of the Waterland retreat, 2 volumes of the liturgy actually are devoted to model texts that are meant to be used throughout the ritual. And the kinds of texts are amazing. There's an essay, there's a proclamation, there are pardons, memorials, petitions, mandates, statements, and placards. And each of these different types of texts has a different function. But when you start really looking at how they function, it turns out that almost all of them are addressed to non-Buddhist beings. So essentially, you're using these texts to communicate with Taoist deities, to communicate with local gods, to communicate with the people who oversee hell, and to ensure that all of them will assemble in this Buddhist space so that they can be sent on the path to salvation. And rather amazingly, the Buddha himself becomes part of this whole bureaucracy. In both in the contemporary variant, which I really very and in this Northern Chinese version, the Buddha is periodically called the Awakened Emperor rather than Drepon, which is a kind of curious title. It's implying that he really is like the head of the bureaucracy and that everyone else in the cosmos needs to listen to him. So it's taking this kind of, again, a Taoist model of how the cosmos works, and it's using that model to ensure that all of the Taoist and local deities kind of behave so that the ritual can be carried out properly. And I think that's just it's a fascinating view of how Buddhism is interacting with other forms of Chinese religion in order to ensure that everyone really can be saved. And with this particular mural, I just love that you have the Buddhas at the top, you have the monastic officiant in the center, you have all of these spirits assembling around them, and then on the side walls you have the messengers ensuring that everything really is going to go as planned. So hopefully that I guess my goal really was to give you a little bit of background for the ritual that will take place at Shirai Temple in the coming days. But I also hope that these paintings may give you a little bit more of a sense of what really is going on in the ritual than you might feel just by simply attending physically. There's so much more to the ritual that we can't necessarily see, particularly if we're not proficients ourselves. And I think the paintings really help us to get in, just to recognize that. I'm very happy to take more questions.
The painting with the Jisan, it reminds me of a painting of Yongle Gong.
Yeah.
The colors are very close.
Yeah.
I wonder they were produced in the same period.
That's very observant. So yeah, Jishan is, just it's not very far from Yongle Gong.
It's not.
Not very far at all. And actually, I don't think they were the same studio that produced the paintings, but they were studios operating in the same region at the same time. Yeah, they were same period.
I also recall my visit to the Royal Museum
Yes.
of
Ontario.
Ontario. Yes, I think they have a huge mural.
That's right.
The similar.
From the same region, same period.
Yeah, I also visited Guangsheng Si.
Yeah.
Is it from Guangsheng Si?
The Royal Ontario Museum mural is from Guangzhou.
Oh yeah. Thank you.
It's very perceptive. Yeah. So actually, to go back to the Venerable's question about signing the names of artists, this mural is signed in one corner with the names of all of the artists who worked on it, and also the names of I think it's the abbot as well as several other monastic leaders are inscribed on the painting as well. So with a lot of the mural paintings, we actually do know the names of the artists who produced them.
To me, it's kind of very interesting. It's just a original inner and outer platform, and also as well as for the preset for the deceased. Nowadays, with more into detail, and this look like the picture as what you explained, with the four head and then also the non-presiding. So to me, it's very interesting.
Yeah, but, the, this painting is, so a couple of things are going on in this painting. One is that I think they are trying to depict, that particular moment in the waterline or something. But the other thing is that the painters have to work within a particular genre, within particular conventions, and because they're actually creating a set of 500 arhats. Every scroll has to have 5 arhats, so they're kind of limited in how they compose the picture. So like some of the ritual details are abstracted because it has to fit the broader picture. I'll show you another painting from the same set that I think is also really interesting. This is one where you see the 5 arhats descending on a cloud, so you can tell that they're enlightened beings rather than just ghosts emerging from the mist. And they're descending toward a group of people who are performing an offering. So in this case, a monastic officiant is leading the offering. He's actually offering incense, and you can kind of see that he's looking up as though he's visualizing the arhats descending. And then there's a group of lay people behind paying obeisance. And what's also really interesting about this work is that in the kind of middle portion of the painting, you can see that there are servants laying out food offerings in front of paintings of arhats. So this is giving you a kind of more complete picture of how the arhat offering is performed. And it does fit quite nicely with liturgies that we have in the same.
I have a question, probably not related to Buddhism, but I was so fascinated by the one that you like the most with so many abstract pictures. I wonder, because all this painting have been preserved for so many years, right? How old are they? 1,000 years?
800?
Like this. Have you seen similar painting, this kind of abstract painting from other cultures at that period of time? Same period of time.
I mean, in East Asia, in Japan, certainly there are equivalents from the same period. In Europe, there are some quite interesting depictions from the year 1000 to 1300 of hell, for example. Any kind of hellish place tends to be a site that generates a lot of artistic creativity. So like with this particular painting, the painter, I think he probably enjoyed painting these ghosts. Like I know that's kind of gruesome to say, but he really was trying to innovate here. And that's actually true in a lot of Buddhist painting from China from this period. You can tell that the painters really enjoyed the ghosts. And that's also true in Europe when you look at depictions of hell.
Same period of time.
Yeah.
No, because when I'm looking at this and now contemporary artists, with the contemporary artists, when now you can see on your phone sometimes you get abstract painting and they ask you to guess how many pictures can you see or how many people in that picture can you find?
Yeah.
And it just amazed me, like 1,000 years ago, people already like you can put this online and say, how many ghosts can you find in the picture?
I gave a version of this talk once, and at the end of the audience, someone came up to me and told me how many ghosts they had counted during the talk. I think it really just has to do with this being a set of 500 arhats divided into 100 scrolls. So they had to have 5 per scroll. With 500 arhat, the grouping of 500 arhats is pretty standard. And then painters will divide that group into 10 scrolls, into 50 scrolls, into 100 scrolls, or even into 500 scrolls. So there are examples where you just have 1 arhat you have 5 arhats, you have 10 arhats, or you have 50. I think it really is like a genre, I guess. Yeah. No, actually, it's the 500 arhats who appeared on Mount Tiantai. And whether those are the same 500 arhats at the first council or not is a question that people have debated for a very long time. But um, the 500 arhats of Mount Tiantai really started to be worshipped commonly in about the 9th and 10th centuries. And they were they became responsible for all sorts of kind of miraculous events in southern China beginning in about the 10th century.
Dr. Bloom, one of the attending in the Zoom asked the question. Okay, please may I know the water and the land service is paid for any form of any religious? I believe this question could be for this particularly the ritual assembly, and the participant can come from different tradition. I mean, different faith tradition, or from any even non-Buddhist or
Yeah,
not Taoist or something.
yeah. I mean, historically, the ritual was conceived to include beings from all of China's major religious traditions, so Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and local religion, and their seats within the ritual for members of all of those traditions. So, for example, local earth gods are local deities. Confucius himself is invited usually to the ritual. Confucius and his disciples are invited. The gods of thunder and wind, which really are more of a Taoist thing and a Buddhist thing, are specifically invited. So members of all of those traditions are specifically summoned to the ritual. I've never seen that the ritual has been adapted in the present to include, to specifically include members of other religious traditions, but I don't see why that wouldn't be possible. It's not something that we see.
Any more questions? Okay, good luck. Okay.
Yes, I just have one last question, right? I think that you mentioned a little bit about the roadshow that we're talking today, the waterland. I'm not sure whether the Tibetan Buddhism, they have something similar to this ritual, and if it does, then any difference or any similarity between those?
That's a great question. As far as I'm aware, there's no waterland ritual in the Tibetan tradition. I don't actually know enough about Tibetan Buddhism to know whether there's something similar. There's no like equivalent in any sort of Theravada tradition either. That said, one way that people have tried to understand the history of the waterland retreat is to trace it back to India and to what are called universal or unimpeded assemblies. So essentially a king or an emperor would offer a feast to anyone, particularly the Sangha, but it would be open to anyone. And sometimes that tradition of a kind of universal offering through the form of a feast has been seen as the root of the waterland. So, that's a very broad notion. It's a very broad kind of ritual practice that you can find in any Buddhist tradition. But in terms of the specificity of the waterland retreat, with things like the bestowal of presets to the ghosts of the dead, the the invocation of Taoist and other local deities. That sort of thing I don't think is seen in other traditions. As I did mention, variations of the waterland ritual are still performed in Korea today. Strangely enough, there's very little evidence for it in Japan. In Japan, ghost feeding rituals were very popular, but as far as I have been able to tell, the waterland itself was not really performed.
Okay, today we are, thank you, Dr. Bloom, give us a very detailed introduction to lead us to understand the waterland and Dharma assembly from an artist's perspective. And he using another painting, like for example, if without the Dr. Bloom explanation, probably we just see, oh, that is a good picture. That's it. And we didn't know the meaning. So thank you, Dr. Bloom, give us a very inside information for waterland. And next week, the Shilai Temple will start with the Waterland Dharma Assembly. And I hope that today, when we have this kind of knowledge, maybe next week, if you have chance to participate, to attend the Shilai Temple, the Waterland, maybe you can get more sense or more feeling about when you in that ritual. Okay. So thank you, Dr. Bloom. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.